Wake up. It's the Sleep Unplugged podcast, episode 134. Sleep in Times of Catastrophe. Burn out the night. Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Unplugged podcast. My name is Chris Winter. I'm a neurologist, sleep specialist, and your host for the podcast. If you're new to the Sleep Unplugged podcast family, welcome. If you're a veteran of the podcast, we're glad you're here. Welcome back. If you want to get in touch with the podcast, you can reach me through Twitter or X or Instagram. It's all Dr. Chris Winter on all those platforms. And I received a lot of nice messages this week, probably none nicer than a letter I got via another sleep doctor who read my book and wrote my book, The Sleep Solution: Why Your Sleep is Broken and How to Fix It. He wrote, hands down, the funniest book I've read in a long time. Catch 22, or a confederacy of dunces with a lot of factual, interesting information about sleep. As a fellow humor writer, I admire his style. That is probably one of the nicest things anybody's ever written about my book. I'm still to this day not entirely comfortable with the title writer. I just read a book called Insomniac City by Bill Hayes. It was given to me over the holidays, and I sort of made it a goal before the holidays were over and work in 2025 hit me like a bag of bricks. I would finish that and found it to be a delightful book. I love any book about New York City. The book talks about the author's relationship with the neurologist Oliver Sacks, who wrote all kinds of books, none better than The Man Who Mistook His Wife as a Hat, and their relationship. And it was really interesting to learn more about Oliver Sacks through the words of his partner prior to his death. Interesting book. I've thoughts about the way insomnia is portrayed in the book, but outside of that, it's a really, really nice read. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the forest fires that are happening out in California and some themes about sleep and maybe even some themes about insomnia. And if you're a listener of the podcast, you're going to say, wait a minute, Chris, this is not the first Monday of the month. You're not allowed to talk about insomnia. And I think we'll have to make a rule for the show. And if you've been a long time listener of the show, we make up little rules and guidances as we go along that if something is really timely, I think we're allowed to break the Insomnia Monday tradition. And we can talk about insomnia on days other than Monday. I think today will be a little bit of that, if it's okay with you. If you're a listener of the show, we have a YouTube page where we post the video content of all of our shows, as well as a Spotify music playlist where we talk about a musical performer or group in the title of the show. This week, the title Burn Out the Night is from Blue Oyster Cult's Burnin' For You single released off their 1981 album Fire of Unknown Origin, which I thought was timely given the fact that these fires out in California we're not entirely sure how they started. I know arson has been investigated. In fact, I saw something, I don't know if it's real or not, that Andrew I don't know if it's Huberman or Huberman, um, who's a super well-known neuroscientist, had posted video that he had taken, I think, of what looked like people maybe trying to set fires or arson or something, which was I did not capture any uh, comparatively interesting videos over the last week or so. I actually spent some time at a beautiful place in Mexico, just pictures of me sitting around reading my book. Um, but anyway, the Blue Oyster Cult off their album Fire of Unknown Origin, Burden for You was probably their biggest single outside of Don't Fear the Reaper, which everybody knows from the Saturday Night Live sketch. That was off their fourth album, Agents of Fortune. Blue Oyster Cult never really achieved a tremendous amount of fame during the time that they were active. And after Fire of Unknown Origin in 81, their albums were very commercially unsuccessful. I always liked Blue Oyster Cult because their lead guitarist Eric Bloom described himself as not lead guitarist, he played stun guitar. And he said that was actually an inside joke related to Star Trek, where you set your phaser to stun, that he played stun guitars. I always thought was pretty great. Blue Oyster Cult got their name from a series of poems by their manager. I forget his name, but he wrote this whole sort of epic poem that was something like about aliens coming and taking over Earth, and there was some reference to the Blue Oyster Cult. They really liked that because cult was kind of big at the time. They put the little umlaut over the O in oyster to make it seem a little bit more ambiguous, and Motorhead and Motley Crue, other Husker Du, a lot of groups added that. It was kind of a sign of heavy metal at the time. And I always thought Blue Oyster Cult was a great name for a band. So we'll put Burnin' for You on the Spotify music playlist. Moving on to the topic, what prompted this? I was listening, I think, to the New York Times on the radio about the fires, and they interviewed a firefighter who, just from his voice when you were listening to him being interviewed, sounded so tired. And he said, there are forest firefighters here that are going 48 to 60 hours without sleep trying to contain the blaze. And when I listened to this interview, the blaze at that time they were not under control. The Palisades and Eaton fires were not at all contained. I think they were both 0% contained. I don't remember if the Hurst fire was part of that situation. And I thought about that and how it relates to people who struggle to sleep. So in this situation, I'm imagining this firefighter, and they're in a terribly tragic, understaffed situation where there is unfathomable nature's fury and loss and fear. And speaking of sleep, I read article after article about people who were being told, hey, you're okay. I know you can probably see the fire and you can smell it, but it's okay. You do not need to evacuate. And people struggling to sleep because they were scared to go to sleep because they didn't know if things would change in the night. And they would wake up and be in a situation where maybe it was too late to evacuate. People, staying behind, trying to fight the fires themselves, protect property. There was an amazing interview where a news reporter was talking to a guy, and the guy was like, listen, if you're abandoning your car, please leave your keys inside so other people can move them if we need to get fire and rescue places. And at some point, the interviewer goes, are you Steve Gutenberg? Remember that guy from Three Men and a Baby and what was it, Police Academy? So anyway, just overwhelming remorse and sadness for the people who are just dealing with this and losing everything. And it doesn't really matter how much you have and what's going on in your life. I think something like a fire would be just unbelievably tragic. And this is all coming on the heels of the residents on the other side of the country in Florida, many of them losing everything in the hurricanes and flooding that happened this year, and people in North Carolina. And I'm just thinking about tragedy and that statement of somebody staying up 48 to 60 hours in order to fight the fire, contrasted with the individual unable to sleep because they're worried about the fire. And as I was driving and listening to this interview, I thought maybe a way we could think about things. And again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, well, insomnia is not a big deal. Think about people who've lost their house in a fire. What are you upset about? What are you worried about? At least you've got a bed and a roof over your head. And certainly you could think of it that way. But I think the more productive way for somebody who's struggling with sleep is maybe to think about the fact that the part of our brain and the wiring of our nervous system that allows that weary firefighter to stay up for 40 to 60 hours to do their service, to work to save what they're able to save is really a superpower. It's a beneficial thing. It's a thing that we want. We want that ability to override sleep and be vigilant. There's a million circumstances we can think about where that would be a positive. From things that are mundane, your flight is delayed. You were supposed to fly out at 9 p.m. Now it's 12:30 and you're just getting ready to board. Now you're getting home very late. You're going to have to drive home late. You can do it. Normally, you would be in bed at that point, but you can do it because your brain has that capacity. You don't go up to the ticket counter and say, look, I'm going to be getting in so late. I'll never be able to stay up to do this. So I guess you're going to have to book me on a flight home tomorrow. I mean, you could if it was more convenient for you, but you have the ability to stay up. These individuals have the ability, the power, the means to stay up and fight these fires for almost 60 hours. And my guess is if you were to talk to these firefighters and ask them, well, what happens after 48 hours? What happens after 60 hours? I bet some of them are so exhausted, they may be falling asleep standing up fighting the fires or going back for a water break, maybe at a truck. I know nothing about fighting fires like of this magnitude. And they may be falling asleep, sitting there having a drink at the truck and getting a breath of, reasonably fresh air away, at least cooler air away from the fire. I actually spent 24 hours with the Fort Worth Fire Department. You can find it online if you type in sleeping around with Dr. Winter. We filmed a couple episodes of individuals who sleep in unusual circumstances and what we can learn from them. And one of the episodes, I spend 24 hours with the Fort Worth Fire Department. And these were individuals who were very good at falling asleep when they were able to fall asleep, had the capacity to fall asleep, and very good at waking up and dealing with crises when they needed to. There was a paper written, I think it was 2018. It was called Addicted to Awake: Sleep Deprivation in the Fire Service. It's a great paper. I would have slightly adjusted the title to Sleep Disturbances in the Fire Service because what it showed was they surveyed somewhere on the order of about 7,000 firefighters from 66 United States fire departments and found that of these firefighters, about 40% of them had sleep problems. So that could be sleep apnea. And I've talked to firefighters who, in their firehouse, have a room for firefighters who do have sleep apnea and a room that don't. So if you snore or make noise or you have untreated sleep apnea or loud snoring, you sleep in this room. If you're a quiet sleeper, you sleep in the other. So sleep apnea, insomnia, and then shift work disorder, which is generally individuals who are somewhat sleep deprived and are struggling in their personal or professional life because of it. So 40% of firefighters have some sleep problem. I mean, they're probably most of them are sleep deprived. Same thing with like medical residents. There's lots of, military, I'm sure young military, probably all pretty sleep deprived. But what was interesting about these firefighters, if you looked at the 40% of so let's say 7,000 firefighters, we'll say 3,000 of them have some sort of sleep disturbance or 40%. Of the 3,000 or 40%, 80% have undiagnosed sleep disturbances, meaning that sleep problem we mentioned, it's not been diagnosed. They're not seeking treatment for it. And that is a huge problem, isn't it? when you think about individuals in these capacities. And this kind of relates back to many of the topics we've talked about before: circadian disorders, stress and anxiety, shift work. Um, all of these things tend to sum to create lots of problems for these individuals who are first responders. And when you think about the problems that kind of happen downstream from these people, certainly accidents, mistakes, and things of that nature could be problematic because of the sleep deprivation that these individuals are incurring, getting behind the wheel of the car to drive home and falling asleep, etc. But just like any sleep disturbances, we've talked about cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, cardiac issues of all comers are a big issue for individuals who are shift workers, a big problem for individuals who are firefighters. We also worry about things like obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome, glucose tolerance, all the things we've talked about before. Again, when I stayed at the Fort Worth Fire Department, we ate really well. They prepared their own meals. They were pretty careful about their nutrition, but truth be told, they are kind of eating around the clock, which makes things very difficult for them. Anxiety, depression, things are very common when you work with individuals or first responders, law enforcement, military. These things are very problematic. Alcohol use is generally very high. They've seen things. There's a lot of PTSD-like behaviors and problems in these with these individuals, and you can understand why getting home, being very excited and sort of amped up about what you've seen, using alcohol to kind of quell that and settle people down to help them sleep. So when you think about first responders, I think about things that they can do to kind of help uh, with their issues, paying attention to the lighting and the sleeping situation in their firehouse, making sure that uh, the foods they eat are healthy and ample opportunity to exercise. There's one a firehouse, I think it was North Carolina, I read about that was actually paying their firefighters. They had paid sleep time, which I thought was awesome. That idea that if you're not, doing something, sleeping might be the best thing you could be doing for your health, but also your ability to fight that fire. There was also information about the shifts that they do. And this is something that I've been involved in a variety of different capacities with different organizations, including firefighters, which is, what's the best way for us to construct our sleep? And, really the takeaway from that research is that any sort of schedule that's kind of working round the clock is generally going to harm sleep. So it tends to become in these exercises, what is the best way we can configure your sleep or your sleep schedule to harm your sleep the least? And there was it wasn't a study, it was a dissertation done by somebody. It was done in 2023, and it looked at, and I'm sorry, I did not write down the name of this individual, but you can look it up. She was a Texas A&M. It was like a PhD thesis. And basically, this individual, she examined the different ways in which fire fire stations construct their schedules. Generally, there's three groups of firefighters. So they're dividing up to 24 hours among these three groups. So the most common way that it's divided is 24 hours on, and then you get the next 48 hours off. And so that way you can, when you're on, the other two groups are getting ready to go on or have just gone off, and you're sort of leapfrogging over that. And there's, of course, there's problems when you're working overtime, you're covering somebody else's shift. Hey, I'm going to switch with this person so they can go on this trip or see their kid play in a baseball game in college, or whatever it is. There are other schedules too that do a 24/72 off. Um, 48-hour shifts on, 96 hours off have become popular. And basically, in her estimation, she felt like looking at the research, the 24/48 schedule seemed to be the best out of the options that are typically given right now. But as we think about the Palisades fire, it becomes very clear that the schedule kind of goes out the window to some extent when there's a crisis. So, the thought that I wanted to kind of leave with here is to it's not about counting blessings, even though I think that we probably sure should. It's not about global warming, which my suspicion is that this plays some role in this, and this will not be the last fire that happens in California. Um, but really thinking about the idea of what it means to be able to stay awake and how we can be comforted in this ability. It's sort of like the ability to sprint. How often during your day do you sprint? But if you had to catch a bus, if you were fleeing a dog that was chasing you in the neighborhood, you could access that ability to help yourself out a little bit. And I think sometimes reframing our ability, our capacity to stay awake longer can make things seem a little bit less intense. That when you go to bed at night and have difficulty falling asleep, rather than panic, rather than fear, anxiety, something's wrong. When I was reading this book, Insomniac City, the author just sort of casually talks about, people who can't sleep, which is interesting because the guy was partnered with Sachs. I would love to know more about their conversations about insomnia. You know, I would think this brilliant neurologist would have a lot to say about that. But again, you can be a neurologist and have zero training in sleep. You could, which is I think a lot of people do. So it's interesting that we cast it as a problem when in fact, maybe it's a strength that allows us to do things that maybe others can't. And I will think about those firefighters when I go to bed at night. And most likely tonight I will fall asleep very quickly. But if I don't, I will think about the positives that come from not being able to fall asleep right away and learning to make sure that we are able to differentiate the situation that a firefighter might be in when they're burning buildings and trees and greenery around them, where they have to make critical decisions. They have to be on their game because their life depends on it. They cannot fall asleep in this situation. Differentiating that from being in a quiet, comfortable, safe house where nothing is on fire. You're just not able to fall asleep and not allowing our response to that situation to get to the point where it is becoming what it is for that firefighter. I think that's an important exercise we all need to adopt. Those of you who have difficulty with falling asleep. And I'm again reminded of the story we've talked about before where Patty Smith, the singer-songwriter, poet, all around badass, would think about that when she went to bed. She would think about being a sailor on a ship in ancient times and having to sleep on the floor on a cot and doing something heroic that impresses the captain. And the captain says, "How can I ever repay you?" And the sailor says, "Could I have one night of sleep in your bed?" And she would imagine that in poet's detail and think about that, how amazing it must have felt for that sailor just to be in that comfortable bed. Maybe the sailor didn't even want to go to sleep because maybe the sailor knew as soon as the sailor fell asleep and woke up, that level of comfort, security, pleasure would be gone. Maybe the sailor was kind of excited to be awake in that comfortable bed and not in a hammock or on the floor in the creaky, wet, rat-infested boat. And I think that I'll imagine tonight when I'm in bed just how excited I am to be there and what a privilege and a blessing it is to be in that place and not fighting a fire, not be without a home, not somewhere terrified about the health and safety of a loved one. I think we need to reframe sometimes not being able to fall asleep as sort of the privilege and the positive that it is, and not necessarily think about it as something going wrong or something that's bad. So that's it. That's my thoughts tonight for the Sleep Unplugged podcast. If you have any similar thoughts about things or shout outs that we can give to people that you know who are going through some really, really, really difficult times in California, let us know. The podcast is doing extremely well right now. We're closing in on a quarter million listeners or a quarter million downloads, and got a lot of really exciting things planned for the upcoming year, including um, what I'm working on now. I'll give you a little sneak peek. Is sort of a March Madness type tournament to determine the champion pillow. So I've been reaching out to pillow companies and bedding companies and saying, hey, let's give me your best pillow. And we're going to figure out a tournament style where we have pillows and seatings and pillows going up against pillows. And we're going to bracketology them down to the best pillow. I'm going to call it the 2025 Sleep Unplugged Pillow Fight. So if you have a favorite pillow brand, and you think it's got a shot at making the tournament and emerging as champion, give me a DM at Dr. Chris Winter and let me know. Please follow the podcast, like the podcast, review the podcast. We love it all. Follow me on social media. And until next week, sleep well.